All right, let's go ahead and resume, and we're going to look at chapter 40, the speech concerning Behemoth. And we'll briefly look at it again, I guess, section by section after the response of Job. We come back to the Lord answering again in verse 6. And what he says about Behemoth takes us through chapter 40. So let's begin by reading verses 7 to 14, 47 to 14. Would someone read that for us?
Dress for action like a man. I will question you, and you will make it known to me. Will you even put me in the wrong? Will you condemn me that you may be in the right? Have you an arm like God? And can you thunder with a voice like his? Adorn yourself with majesty and dignity. Clothe yourself with glory and splendor. Pour out the overflowings of your anger, and look on everyone who is proud and abase him. Look on everyone who is proud and bring him low, and tread down the wicked where they stand. Hide them all in the dust together. Bind their faces in the world below. Then I will also acknowledge to you that your own right hand can save you.
All right, now look at this passage. This is once again God telling Job that he's wrong. And God describes his own power over against Job's weakness. But notice in what sense particularly God describes his power. Specifically, it is power to judge, power to deal with the wicked. He asked Job in verse 11 if Job can rouse himself to great anger, obviously at evil. Verse 12, if he can bring down the proud and the wicked. Verse 13, if he can send them into the dust. And of course, verse 14, if you can do that, well, then I'll say you know what you're doing. So God does express the fact that he's more powerful than Job, but it is especially in reference to dealing with evil, the problem of evil. And so now God is going to, in a more specific way, answer Job's question. So these verses are really introductory, saying you don't really know how to handle evil, you don't really know how to bring it to an end. So I am going to tell you a little of what's going on. If someone would then read verses 15 to 24, just the rest of this chapter, verses 15 to 24.
Behold the Behemoth, which I made as I made you. He eats grass like an ox. Behold, his strength is in his loins, and his power is in the muscles of his belly. He makes his tail stiff like a cedar. The sinews of his thighs are knit together. His bones are fused with bronze, and his limbs like bars of iron. He is the first of the works of God. Let him who made him bring near his sword. The mountains yield food for him where all the wild beasts play. Under the lotus plants he lies in the shelter of the reeds and the marsh. In the shade the lotus trees covered, the willows of the brooks surround him. Behold, the river is turbulent, he is not frightened. He is confident that the Jordan rushes against him now. And when taken by his eyes, he pushes him into the sea.
All right, so we have Behemoth. The question that is always raised is, what is the identity of Behemoth? And a typical answer is that Behemoth is the hippopotamus, primarily based on the idea that he's in the river in verse 23, although some would identify him as the crocodile. If you look carefully, though, at what the text says about him, he really seems to be composite and have no actual single identity in the natural world. On the one hand, verse 15, he eats grass. So that would seem to rule out something like a crocodile. Verse 16, however, he has great power in his legs and his belly. Verse 17, he seems to have a very large and powerful tail, like a tree. That would seem to rule out the hippopotamus. Verse 18, simply that he's very strong. Bones are like iron and so forth. Verse 19, he's the first of the works of God, is a little mysterious. It may describe more him in terms of his rank rather than the order in which he was created. That is to say, he's first in the sense of being really powerful. But notice in verse 20, he dwells in the mountains, which is contrary to dwelling in the rivers. Verse 21, he's under the lotus plants. Now, the lotus plants are in marshes, lowlands, water. So on the one hand, he's described as in the mountains. On the other hand, he's described in low wetlands. It then speaks of him, verse 22, as under all kinds of trees, such as the willow, and that when the rivers are turbulent, it doesn't really affect him. So what do we make of Behemoth? Again, as I've already suggested to you, in my opinion, Behemoth does not have a counterpart, single counterpart in the natural world. It's not a crocodile, it's not a hippopotamus, it's not, whatever you want to describe. It is a composite beast that on the one hand can be high in the mountains, on the other hand can be down in the wetlands and in the marshes. He has every kind of power. Every part of his body is extremely powerful, and no one can subdue him. And this is in the context of God challenging Job about judging the earth and judging the wicked. As I've already indicated to you, the word behemoth literally just means beasts, the plural of beast. The very name beasts would seem to suggest he is a composite creature, that he is, as I indicated at the beginning of this course, a kind of apocalyptic animal. And indeed, the closest parallel we have to something like Behemoth is in apocalyptic literature. Again, we see in Daniel these various beasts of Daniel chapter 7 that combine parts of different kinds of animals. It might be a leopard with wings or something like that. And we see in Revelation various composite creatures. I think probably in terms of an analogy, a text that is analogous that gives us a clue into what's going on here, Daniel is probably most helpful because you have all of these strange composite beasts. And what do they represent? They represent the powers of the earth, specifically the Gentile powers that are ruling the world. And I would even say more broadly, this plurality of beasts in this composite form in the book of Job represents what the Apostle Paul would speak of as principalities and powers, which can be demonic powers, which can be human powers, human emperors, which can be anyone who's powerful, and then all the way down to just the whole chaos of human evil. So I would suggest that Behemoth represents the totality of the forces of violence and danger in the world, with a special emphasis, again, based on the prologue to the speech in verses 7 and following, with a special emphasis on moral evil. So we're not really talking about lions and tigers here. We're talking about demonic powers, powerful states, empires, wicked men, dangerous people. As God says in his speech to Job, the proud and the wicked. And I believe what God is saying to Job at this point is, Job, there is a very complex beast of evil out there. It has all these different features, all different kinds of power, and it dwells everywhere. It's in the mountains, it's in the marshes. And you can't control it, you can't handle it, you can't subdue it. The implication, of course, is only God can subdue it. Only God can bring this moral evil to heel. In the context of Job's questioning, and what we've just read in chapters 38 and 39, I think basically what God is saying is, Job, you think I'm unaware of all of this in the world, all of this evil. I'm very aware of it. But in fact, I'm the only one who can subdue it. And so you're going to have to let me do it. If you think you can do it, have a go. If you're able to do it, I'll applaud. But of course, Job knows he can't. So I really think Behemoth, in my reading, is pretty straightforward, not all that difficult to unravel, but we need to go to chapter 41, which is, of course, Leviathan. Yes?
God says, "Behold the image which I made, as I made you," and a lot of the entire description seems, at least from our understanding, could also plausibly be a dinosaur, brontosaurus, something that is so massive and big that even the mountain terrains, or
Right.
that he can sleep in peace, that he's so massive that nothing can destroy him. Is it possible to take it as that?
I mean, I don't know that Job would have any frame of reference for that. I mean, it's conceivable. But again, I think it's really more in a frame of reference that Job himself would know and experience. And I mean, it's just, and again, I would say, I don't really think it's an animal at all. I mean, I think it represents the totality, the complexity of moral evil and the powers and the principalities, the same as you have in the prologue here. So I don't really think it should be identified as any specific animal.
So how would you explain verse 15 then, like in that understanding, which I made as I made you?
Yeah, I mean, God made everything, right? So he made all of creation, he made the angels, he made all of humanity. So the whole world is made by God, and all of the forces that are now operating with evil and with chaos, God made them too. And so only God can bring them to bear. So again, I think all of these chaotic forces, principalities and powers, are being represented under the rubric of Behemoth. Okay? Where are we? Chapter 41, Leviathan. Now he begins with the same kind of questions. Would someone read for us? Let's see. Let me make sure I get it right. Verses 1 to 8. Verses 1 to 8.
Can you draw out Leviathan with a fishhook, or press down his tongue with a cord? Can you put a rope in his nose, or pierce his jaw with a hook? Will he make many pleas to you? Will he speak to you soft words? Will he make a covenant with you to take him for your servant forever? Will you play with him as with a bird, or will you put him on a leash for your girls? Will traders bargain over him? Will they divide him up among the merchants? Can you fill his skin with harpoons, or his head with fishing spears? Lay your hands on him. Remember the battle. You will not do it again.
All right, so here, just as before, he challenges Job as to whether Job can take on the task. And he indicates pretty clearly that Job is not up to it. And I think that doesn't need much more explanation than that. I think it's pretty clear, pretty straightforward. What we're going to have to figure out is, what is Leviathan and what is God's attitude towards Leviathan? Let's see. Let's skip down a little bit and look at the description of Leviathan. And I would say, let's start at verse 14. And would someone, well, we'll just break it up a little bit, read through verse 20, 14 to 20.
You can open the doors of his face, around his teeth is terror. His back's made of rows of shields shut up closely, as with a seal. One is so near to another that no air can come between them. They are joined to one another, they clasp each other and cannot be separated. His sneezings flash forth light, and his eyes are like the eyelids of the dawn. Out of his mouth go flaming torches, sparks of fire leap forth. Out of his nostrils comes forth smoke, as from a boiling pot and burning brushes.
Okay, look at what it says just in terms of the description of Leviathan. First of all, he has an incredible set of teeth. If he opens his mouth, the teeth make a very tight row that you don't want to mess with. Verse 15, his back is made of shields. In other words, you cannot pierce his hide. Verse 16, his teeth are so close together, or I'm sorry, that the mail of his hide is so tight that you cannot even see air, get air between them. So he is like invulnerably armored. Verse 18, interestingly, when he sneezes, light flashes out. And light comes from his eyelids, which bespeaks of some kind of supernatural power. 19, more specifically, he breathes fire. Out of his mouth are flaming torches, sparks of fire leap forth. And 20 as well. From his nostrils comes smoke, and it's a boiling pot. So, and I guess we should include verse 21. His breath kindles coals, and a flame comes forth from his mouth. So, if we were to describe this in anything we could specifically identify, it would be a dragon, right? If you've read or seen the Hobbit and looked at Smaug, wow, this really sounds like Smaug, right? He's got this incredible hide that is all but invulnerable. He's got these sharp teeth, and he breathes fire, and he is totally terrifying. Let's read on a little bit, verses 22 through, oh goodness, well, let's just read the rest of the chapter, 22 to 34. Someone read that.
In his neck abides strength, and terror dances before him. The foes of his flesh stick together, firmly cast on him and immovable. His heart is hard as a stone, hard as the lower millstone. When he raises himself up, the mighty are afraid. At the crashing they are beside themselves. Though the sword reaches him, it does not avail, nor the spear, the dart, or the javelin. He counts iron as straw, and bronze as rotten wood. The arrow cannot make him flee. For him, sling stones are turned to stubble. Clubs are counted as stubble. He laughs at the rattle of javelins. His underparts are like sharp potsherds. He spreads himself like a threshing sledge on the mire. He makes the deep boil like a pot. He makes the sea like a pot of ointment. Behind him he leaves a shining wake. One would think the deep to be white-haired. On earth there is not like his like, a creature without fear. He sees everything that is high. He is king over all the sons of pride.
Well, what do we have here? First of all, if you look through the passage we just read, you discover there's a little catalog interwoven in there. The catalog, we talked about how Job weaves all these little catalogs in terms we were talking about its genre. The catalog is a catalog of weapons, human weapons. He speaks of verse 26, the sword, the spear, the dart, the javelin. He speaks of iron and bronze as parts of weapons. Verse 28, the arrow, sling stones, clubs, and again, the javelin. So we have here a catalog of human weapons. And the point is, no human weapon can avail against him. No human being is able to stop him. Nothing in the armory of men is able to withstand this creature. Beyond that, again, it speaks of how strong he is, how powerful he is. He is described as having, I would think, you almost have to say he is sentient. At the beginning of the text, verse 3, 41:3, will he make many pleas to you? Will he speak to you soft words? Implies that he's able to speak. Moving on towards the end of the text, it speaks of him laughing. Lost the place real quick. Ta-da. What verse is it? 29. Yes. Clubs are counted as stubble. He laughs at the rattle of javelins. And then the end of the passage, verse 34, he is king over the sons of pride. So he's described on the one hand as a ferocious monster, as again, like a dragon. He is apparently huge. He is invulnerable. He breathes fire. But he also apparently can speak and can laugh. And he is proud. He is arrogant. So who is Leviathan? Well, it is a remarkable thing that the book begins with Satan in chapters 1 and 2, but then Satan just disappears. He vanishes. And you'd think that the resolution to the book would have to say something about the one who started the whole process. When you come to Revelation chapter 12, where you have the vision of the great dragon, John specifically identifies the dragon in his vision as the devil and Satan. So I would suggest that the great dragon here is understood, should be understood to be Hasatan, Satan, who is the great embodiment of evil. And so to put these two together, first of all, before I go any further, I think you have Behemoth, which is this kind of system. People, powers, principalities, the proud and the wicked, that is evil. Leviathan is the main guy, the central source of all wickedness, Satan, the great dragon. It is obvious that God says, Job, neither you nor any other human can deal with Leviathan. Does God himself intend to deal with Leviathan? Well, I would argue that he does. The text is a little bit difficult and a little obscure. The Hebrew is not easy, or in some parts I think it has just been routinely mistranslated. But let me look at the passage. It is Job 41, verses 9 to 12. Here it is in the ESV, 41, 9 to 12. Behold, the hope of a man is false. He is laid low even at the sight of him. Verse 10, no one is so fierce that he dares to stir him up. Who then is he who can stand before me? Who hath given to me that I should repay him? Whatever is under the whole heaven is mine. And then he goes back, I will not keep silence concerning his limbs, or his mighty strength, his goodly frame, etc. Now, when you look at that passage, it appears to be, as it is translated, just a continuation of verses 1 to 8, where God is saying to Job, Job, you can't possibly fight Leviathan. You don't have enough power. So verse 9 in the ESV, behold, the hope of man is false, would say nobody can subdue him. People are laid low at the sight of him. Again, no one can even enter battle. They would be so terrified by him. And then it goes on, and he, again, in the standard interpretation, God is still speaking of Job when he says, at the middle of verse 10, "Who then is he that can stand before me?" In other words, God is saying to Job, "Job, do you think you can stand before me?" And verse 11, "Who has given to me that I should repay him whatever under the whole of heaven is mine?" Again, God is saying, "Job, do you think that I need to give an answer to you?" Now, that's certainly a conceivable and coherent interpretation as the text is translated. As it is, if you take that translation and you read through the whole chapter, you've got this portrait of Leviathan as this ferocious dragon, king of pride, and God says nothing about what he intends to do with it, or what he thinks of it. And so for many commentators, such as Sal in his commentary, Sal says, well, you know, God really doesn't intend to subdue Leviathan at all. He doesn't say anything about subduing Leviathan. And he read some articles that took the same position, that God has no intention of defeating, destroying Leviathan. He's just going to kind of let Leviathan thrive. Well, given this translation, as I say, you can see how that would be a legitimate interpretation. However, I don't think the translation is right. First of all, it's a little, just as it is translated, it's a little bit jolting, or it's out of order. God does speak at the beginning of his addresses in chapter 38 and again in chapter 40. He speaks to Job and says, "Job, are you sure you want to take me on? Are you sure you want to argue your case against me? Or stand up like a man, gird your loins, we'll talk." It's rather strange that well into his speech, after he's already started talking about Leviathan, God would suddenly speak of himself and say, "Who then is he who can stand before me? And who has given to me that I should repay him?" So just in terms of the flow of the passage, I think it's kind of peculiar that God would speak of himself at that point. However, more to the point, I think the translation is wrong. Or at points it's correct but misplaced. Here's how I think it should be translated. I'll read it to you and I'll write it out. This is 41, beginning in verse 9. "Behold, his expectation is false. Should one be overthrown at the very sight of him? He is not so deadly, should someone magically invoke him. And who is he that would stand before me? Who will approach me that I should give satisfaction? Whatever exists under all the heaven is mine." Now that sounds like what we just have in the ESV, but you'll see I have a very different take on it. "I will not be silent at his blathering words of boasting, and at his claims of power, and at his high evaluation of himself." So as you can tell, that is quite a different translation. In my book, the text is like a little bit of text and almost an entire page of footnote, because obviously I have to defend every part of my translation, but let me lay it out for you and I'll give you the basics. "Behold, his expectation is false. Should one be overthrown at the very sight of him? Now, my translation, "Behold, his expectation is false is in fact just a straight literal translation. Other translations read things into it, add things into it. The ESV for verse 9, again, behold, the hope of man is false. It doesn't say the hope of man. It says his expectation. Well, it's been talking about Leviathan. Lay your hands on him. Remember the battle. You won't do it again. So I think when it says, behold, his expectation is false, again, that's just a straight literal translation. There's nothing fancy going on there. It's referring to Leviathan. God is saying that Leviathan has a false expectation. And then the second line of verse 9, routinely translated, he is laid low, that is, a man is laid low at the very sight of him. I translate as, should one be overthrown at the very sight of him. Again, this is quite a literal translation because in the Hebrew text, it is very clear this is a question. And the fact that there's a question here, there's a grammatical marker in Hebrew that tells you when a statement is a question. This has a grammatical marker telling you this is a question. And again, I've rendered it quite literally, should one be overthrown at the sight of him? The implication of this question as a rhetorical question is no. Now, why do translators render it the way they do? Why do they have it as in the ESV, that a man is laid low even at the sight of him? Well, they're assuming he's still telling Job, you can't possibly fight Leviathan. But in my opinion, that's not what God is doing. God is saying that in his eyes, in God's eyes, Leviathan's not all that powerful. Leviathan's not such a scary monster to God. And so when God says, as I again have translated it really quite literally, this is not some kind of sleight of hand translation. It clearly is a question. Should one be overthrown at the sight of him, with the implication, no. It means I personally don't find him all that scary. We then go on to verse 10, which I have translated, he is not so deadly, should one magically invoke him. The word magically is included for clarity. It's not in the original, but you'll see why it's there in a moment. First of all, again in the standard translation, no one is so fierce. The key word there is translated in many translations as fierce, as if it's a reference to personal courage. But the word does not mean fierce in the sense of being courageous and, willing to go into battle. It means deadly. It means dangerous. It is something you would routinely use of an animal, a ferocious, deadly animal. And of course, Leviathan here is portrayed as an animal kind of critter. And so when God says it's not he, the warrior, is not fierce. It is he, Leviathan, is not deadly to God. And then it says, should someone, and I've translated as you see, magically invoke him. Again, the standard translation, no one is so fierce that he dares to stir him up. Now, to dare to stir up, that's not in the Hebrew at all. That's kind of, being poetic in their, paraphrastic in their translation. The key word there is to arouse, to raise up. And people routinely assume that this is saying, if you get him mad, arouse him in the sense of waking him up and making him mad, getting him into a fight, you'll regret it. But I don't think that's what it means at all. The word translated to arouse is the same word Job uses in chapter 3 when he says, let them curse that day who rouse up Leviathan. And it means to magically invoke Leviathan as an act of black magic. You remember in Job's curse, he said, may the black magicians, the sorcerers, those who are ready to rouse up Leviathan, may they curse the day of my birth. God is saying, well, if someone rouses Leviathan, that's not such a big deal. I can handle him. He's not all that deadly. So again, I think the standard interpretation here is really completely wrong. Now the next part is not so much mistranslated as I think it is misunderstood. In the ESV, who then is he who can stand before me? Who has given me that I should repay him? Whatever is under the whole of heaven is mine. My translation is basically the same. Who is he that would stand before me? Who will approach me that I should give satisfaction? Whatever exists under all of heaven is mine. So I can write that out, but it's basically the same, as you can tell. And I want you to notice, though, a couple of things about this statement. Well, let me back up, first of all. Routinely, as I just said, this statement is attributed to God. Who is he that would stand before me? This is it's attributed to God, not just in the sense that God spoke it, but that God is speaking about himself. Who is he that would stand before me? Who will approach me that I should give satisfaction? And whatever exists under all of heaven is mine. Whatever exists in brackets. All right. So again, as it's routinely interpreted, this is God speaking of himself. God is saying, no one can stand before me. No one can demand I give satisfaction. Everything under heaven is mine. And it could be said by God, obviously. God, no one can stand before God. No one has the right to demand satisfaction of God. God rules everything. That's all true. However, the tone of the statement just to me does not sound like God. It sounds very egocentric. Notice everything in here is me, mine, mine. Who would stand before me? Who will approach me that I should give satisfaction? Everything under heaven is mine. I mean, again, God could say that, but the tone of it, frankly, sounds like boasting in a bad sense. But then the very next verse, I'm going to come back to this in a moment. The very next verse, in my opinion, should be translated, I will not be silent at his blathering words of boasting. Not, I will not be silent concerning his limbs. Again, I will not be silent. That part of it is pretty straightforward. There's a little Hebrew issue there, but we won't go into that. The real issue is where it's translated by some as limbs. but in my opinion should be translated boasting. The Hebrew word, in context, is the Hebrew word baz, which in English transliteration, Roman letters would be like bad, but it doesn't mean bad. It always refers to speech in every other text. Taking it to mean limb is unique to this passage. And it really means kind of blathering words. Really, baz has a close English analogy in blah, blah, blah. It's words that are meaningless. The word bath, for example, is used for pagan chants of divination in Isaiah 44:25 and Jeremiah 50:36. Isaiah 44:25 and Jeremiah 50:36. However, it can refer to boasting. Just a moment. It can refer to boasting as in Job 11:3. Job 11:3. And analogous texts are Isaiah 16:6 and Jeremiah 48:30. So why do they translate it as limbs? I think it's because of what follows. They think it must be talking about how powerful he is, and therefore talking about his body and his limbs and his mighty strength and so forth. But the word is not an obscure word. Again, this is not a place where I'm like citing some weird obscure reference, or I'm using a word in a very rare way. This is the common meaning of the word bad. It means kind of blathering speech, like blah, blah, blah. It is used again for pagan divination. It is used for boasting, and I think that's what it means here. So in my opinion, who is speaking these words? This is God citing Leviathan. This is what Leviathan says. Leviathan says, "Who is he that would stand before me? Who will approach me that I should give satisfaction? Whatever exists under all of heaven is mine." Now, I don't consider this next point to be like a lockdown argument that absolutely proves my case, but it is at least noteworthy that when Jesus is tempted by Satan in the temptation narratives, you know, Satan comes before him and asks him to turn stones to bread, that sort of thing. And the great temptation, the last temptation, bow down, worship me, I will give you all the kingdoms of the earth because they all belong to me. So Satan considers himself, and what to make of that, I'm not going to venture an opinion on, but he certainly considers himself to be ruler over everything under heaven, the earth, and to be ruler over the kingdoms of the world. And so again, I think this is the boasting of Leviathan. Go ahead.
Dr. Garrett, can you note that there's a different versification between the English Bibles here and the Hebrew text?
There is. I could give it to you. I didn't know who would want me to give it. In the Hebrew text, it's chapter 49, 1-4. In the English text, it's 9-12.
The reason why I asked is because I was trying to follow you along as I brought my Hebrew Bible.
Right. And you were confused. Yeah, this is one of the few places where the Hebrew versification is different from the English versification. So it's the same content, but just different verse numbers. But yes, it is 49, 1-4 in the Hebrew. 41, 1-4 in the Hebrew Bible. Okay? The very last line, well, let me write down what I have. For verse 12, I would translate it, I will not be silent at his blathering words of boasting. I will not be silent. Whoops. at his bath. His blathering words of boasting is how I translate it. I want to get out the concept of blah, blah, blah. And then the last line, I translate, and at his claims to power, and at his high evaluation of himself. Now, this is again a fairly literal translation. Literally, the text reads, at his word of strength, which I translate, his claims to power. The very last part of the text is quite obscure, but I think it refers to a high evaluation regarding someone as being, really wonderful. And I think it is God speaking of Leviathan's high evaluation of himself. So I translate it again, at his claims to power, and at his high evaluation of himself. Of himself, I have added, so that's in brackets. So, what is the significance of this passage as I understand it? In my opinion, this is God speaking of his own attitude towards Leviathan. He's not afraid of Leviathan. He does not consider Leviathan a threat. He does not consider Leviathan to be particularly dangerous to himself. He hears all of his boasting and he considers it to be empty and meaningless, and he does not intend to remain silent at Leviathan's boasting. So what does it mean? It means God will deal with Leviathan. And then all the rest of the passage where it talks about how powerful he is, how ferocious he is, and how no human weapon can stand against him, again, it is making the point, this primary source of evil, Leviathan, no human can deal with. Only God can deal with it. Only God can bring it down, and God will deal with Leviathan in his own time, in his own way. So in contrast to a number of interpreters, such as Saul, I think God does speak of Leviathan as an evil creature, really as the primordial evil, the source of all evil, and God does indicate he will bring Leviathan down. He will take care of Leviathan in his own time, in his own way. And therefore, Job submits and is silent. When you put God's speech together, the two parts of it, 38-39 and 40-41, 38-39 answer Job's claim that the universe, the world is in chaos. There is no moral order to it. And so all that stuff we saw about the natural world is God saying to Job, Job, everything is managed by me. Nothing is out of order. Nothing is out of place. What to you looks like a world that's just totally violent and crazy, in fact, I'm managing the whole thing. In just a moment, everything that to you is fixed and stable, I made it that way. So against Job's complaint of chaos, God says, in fact, the world is in order, I made it that way, and I am maintaining it. But then against the question of evil, Behemoth and Leviathan, Job says, you cannot deal with the complex, multiform image of evil that exists in the world, Behemoth, which again in my view is all the proud and the wicked, the principalities, the powers, this huge complex world of evil. Behemoth, God says, you cannot deal with it. Leviathan, the primordial source of evil, you cannot slay him, but I'm not afraid of him. I hear his boasting, and I will deal with it. So he ends reassuring Job that he will subdue evil. Okay, go ahead.
Is there any reference to A&E cultures for Leviathan or Behemoth?
Oh yeah, definitely. Of course, as you know, Leviathan appears a number of places in the Bible, such as Isaiah, but he appears in Ugaritic literature, for example, where it's normally rendered as Lotan, but it's the same word, and it's this primordial dragon creature. So basically, the Bible has taken the image of Lotan, Leviathan, this dragon, sea monster creature, and has sort of used it as a representative for evil and specifically of Satan, in my view. Okay? So that, in a nutshell, in my view, is God's answer. And Job says, well, okay, I submit. I am completely yielded. So we then come to Job's response to the Lord, which for the most part I think is pretty straightforward. Job chapter 42, verse 2, I know you can do all things. No purpose of yours can be thwarted. Who is this that hides counsel without knowledge? Therefore I have uttered what I did not understand, things too wonderful for me, which I did not know. So basically he says, well, you asked who hides counsel without knowledge. Well, that would be me. You know, I did that myself. And he quotes God, hear and speak. I will question you. You will make it known to me. He said, well, now I've heard of you by the hearing of the ear. Now my eye sees. He says, I have had this revelation to me. Verse 6, and you read a couple of articles on this, one of the most controversial and difficult passages in the whole book, a verse that seems very easy. In the ESV, therefore I despise myself and repent in dust and ashes. As translated, it just sounds like Job is saying, I'm thoroughly embarrassed. I made a fool of myself, so I despise myself, and I repent of everything, and I fall down in dust and ashes. So like the dust and ashes are the place where he falls down on his knees and repents. So again, Job feels himself to be humiliated and to have made a fool of himself, and so now he falls down in the dust on his knees and he repents. But interpreters through the years have noticed that Hebrew doesn't really seem to mean that. First of all, where the ESV says, I despise myself, the word myself is not in there. And in fact, the verb does not mean despise, it means to reject. It is a standard basic Hebrew vocabulary word, and it means I reject something. So, what does he reject? Clearly he doesn't reject himself, but what does he reject? The second thing is the notion that the verb translated to repent, well, the word repent to us connotes turning away from sin. And in certain contexts, this verse can mean turning away from sin, but of itself, it doesn't mean that. Of itself, it basically means to change your mind, to rethink your position. So, of itself, the verb does not connote repentance. It only connotes repentance if you especially change your mind about your sin. So, he just says, I change my mind, and then most significantly, what's translated as in dust and ashes, well, if you translate it very, very literally, it is over dust and ashes. And scholars have noted for a long time that that's kind of strange. That's a very unusual expression. And it would not normally mean like I fall down in dust and ashes and repent. More than that, The verb to change the mind, it's used, gosh, I don't want to, trying to avoid getting technical here. It's used with this preposition over to mean what it is you are changing your mind about. To put it real simply, this is an ordinary standard Hebrew idiom. There's nothing strange about it. Literally translated, it means I change my mind about dust and ashes. I think that's the simplest way to put it. That's just a very straightforward, literal translation. I change my mind about dust and ashes. So, the whole verse, of course, verse 6 here, 42:6, translated just very literally with no embellishment. Therefore, I will reject, and you could say change your mind. I have translated it rethink. Basically, same thing. Change your mind about, or change your mind and rethink dust and ashes. I would suggest that is a very, very literal translation. What does he reject? Not himself. He rejects dust and ashes. What is he rethinking? What is he changing his mind about? Dust and ashes. So, what does it mean then to reject and rethink dust and ashes? In my view, dust and ashes throughout the book of Job and in other idiom as well, elsewhere in the Old Testament as well, represents the human condition. The human condition of being lowly, of being dust of the earth, of being frail, of just being something that perishes. So if that's what dust and ashes means, if that's what it refers to, what does it mean to say that Job rejects it and is rethinking it? I think what it means is the fact that Job came into the conflict, came into the situation, again, believing that human beings are just being pulverized by God. Without rehearsing the whole story again, Job, a righteous man, has suffered greatly. He has been smitten by God. And he imagines people as just dust and ashes being crushed by God. He has been fixated on his former suffering and pain. What he is realizing is that this is not the whole story. His interpretation has been wrong. God doesn't just smash people. God is not unfair. And his fixation on his pain has misled him. So now he is no longer going to make his own pain and his interpretation of it as a miscarriage of justice rule the day. He's going to acknowledge that God thinks of him as more than dust and ashes, and that God is doing things even in his suffering that are beyond Job's understanding. And finally, I would say you can think back again to the demonic theology of Job chapter 4, where the demon, the spirit that comes to Eliphaz, he would thoroughly speak of human beings as nothing but dust and ashes, despised by God. Remember, they die, no one notices. and they have no knowledge, no understanding. They're nothing. Job realizes that we're not nothing. And he realizes that God is in control of everything. Now, what I would say to you is that this resolves in Job's mind the problem of evil. But it doesn't resolve the problem of evil by giving Job a really specific answer. It's a general answer. Part 1, God maintains the order of the universe. Part 2, God will deal with evil, Behemoth and Leviathan. But again, this is kind of like apocalyptic. When you go back to the book of Daniel, what is the situation? Israel has lost its power, it's lost its kingdom, it's now just a province of Gentile empires, and there's no clear end in sight. The answer is that a great stone will smash the feet of the image of Daniel chapter 2 and bring it down, and a great mountain will emerge as the kingdom of God, or that a son of man will appear and bring down the kingdoms of the Gentiles and reestablish the glory of the people of Israel? That's a very general answer. Nothing is really said about how it's going to happen. Even when you get to the book of Revelation, where you have the evil of persecution and the endurance of the saints, you have a general sense it will end when God brings it to an end, when Jesus comes back and that sort of thing. But I don't think it's real specific. There's not a lot you can say in terms of, well, I know how it's all going to work out, in my opinion. Here in the book of Job, God just basically says to Job, I'm dealing with it. I will handle it. And Job says, well, okay. Now, go back to what we said about the paradoxical wisdom of God, that third species of wisdom. Who would have imagined that the destruction of Leviathan would involve the cross? No one. It's way beyond human understanding. But in my view, that's where it all finally ends up. So there is this great evil in the world that God must deal with, but God will deal with it in His own time, in His own way. Job, meanwhile, has to simply be patient. He has to fear God, turn from evil, maintain his faith. So I think that is how the problem of evil is addressed in the book of Job. And it looks forward to an eschatological solution, a solution that is an act of God. It does not tell you specifically at this point how the evil is going to be dealt with, but it does give hints, as we'll get to in a moment. Let's finish looking at the book first of all, and then we'll talk a little bit about its Christian relationship to Christian doctrine. After this, verse 7, chapter 42, verse 7, the Lord has spoken these words to Job. The Lord said, Eliphaz the Temanite, my anger burns against you and against your two friends, for you have not spoken of me what is right, as my servant Job has. Without going into detail here, the idioms that are used are very, very strong idioms. This is a way of saying, I am totally infuriated at you. I am ready to consume you in fire. So this is God using language of the most extreme anger toward Eliphaz and the three friends. There's nothing minor about it. He then tells them to make these sacrifices, and my servant Job will pray for you, for I will accept his prayer, not to deal with you according to your folly. I mentioned to you way back that in Job's pilgrimage, one of the things he goes through is the redemptive sufferer. He goes through redemptive suffering. And we had talked at that point about how he identifies more closely with the lowly and the poor and the oppressed and all that sort of thing. But here we see him actually doing a work of redemption. Job, the sufferer, the righteous sufferer, prays for the sinners, Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar, to restore them and to avert the wrath of God. The lesson here that we're going to explore at the very last hour of our lecture, the lesson is that there is a kind of suffering that is redemptive, in which a righteous person suffers by the will of God, not for his sin, but for his righteousness. And there is great power in that kind of suffering. Without trying to develop it in detail here, think of how often Paul alludes to this in his theology. How frequently he will give these extended lists of all the different things he has suffered for the sake of the church. And how he even says in Colossians, I fill up in my body what is lacking in the afflictions of Christ. That in some way his afflictions, his suffering, has a redemptive purpose for the life of the church. Not that he takes away their sin, but that simply, again, there is great power in the suffering of the righteous for the sake of other people.